Good morning, I guess good afternoon, and welcome to the Children and Family Affairs Subcommittee. Thank you for joining us today, and we're going to begin with a prayer by Representative Stevens and then the pledge. So if you would all stand for the prayer and the pledge, please.
Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, we're so grateful for today. Father, we're thankful for the beautiful weather that we're enjoying outside, and we know that springtime's right around the corner. Father, we are so thankful for the state of Tennessee and for those of us that are in positions of influence like this that we have today. Father, we pray that you'll give us guidance and wisdom as we make decisions, especially for those that affect the children of the state. Father, I pray that you'll wrap your arms around DCS and all the agencies that work with DCS to make a difference in the lives of the children of this state. And Father, I pray that you'll bless everyone involved with this and that when all things that we'll seek to be like your Son. We pray all these things through Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you. Attention, salute, pledge. I
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic
for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you all. Madam Clerk, would you please call the roll?
Representatives Bricken, here. Farmer, Gant,
here.
Garrett, Harris, Jernigan, yep. Powell, present. Stevens,
here.
Chair Lady Littleton,
here.
Chair Lady, you have a quorum.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Members, are there any personal orders that we have today? Seeing none, then we're just going to move forward. Today we're hearing testimony on adoption from a panel of people. We have several here, and we're all excited about this. And we're going to go out of session and call up the Department of Children's Services, please. So we are out of session. And if DCS would come up, please. And introduce yourselves for the record. And thank y'all very much for being here today. And if you would please introduce yourself and who you're with for the record, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair Lady. I am Sandra Wilson, Deputy Commissioner of Child Programs for the Department of Children's Services.
And good afternoon. Good afternoon. My name is Sammy Mayfair, and I'm Deputy General Counsel for the Department of Children's Services. So first of all, we'd like to talk to you just a little bit about the licensing process. The Department of Children's Services does have an internal child welfare licensing division. We license a variety of entities of approximately 260 licenses annually. But included under that umbrella are also licensing the child placing agencies, which are the adoption agencies. Currently, there are 35 domestic adoption agencies licensed to practice in the state of Tennessee. Of those agencies, 13 also provide for international adoption services for Tennessee families seeking to adopt a child from abroad. Adoption agencies that are licensed outside the state of Tennessee may maintain offices and provide adoption services in Tennessee if they are also licensed in Tennessee. They must subject themselves to Tennessee licensure, follow Tennessee statute, Tennessee rule, and be regulated by the Tennessee licensing office to be able to operate here. Our licensing division is governed by statute, which I've included up here, and we also have our licensing rules and regulations that set out our actual licensing processes. Contained with that, for any agency licensed, a child placing agency licensed in the state of Tennessee, those agencies have at least one licensing evaluation, an annual evaluation, and also at least one unannounced licensing visit completed with each agency. During these visits and throughout the course of the licensure year, the department does review of the services that are being provided to the children and families. We do compliance reviews of files, making sure everything in the files are as they should be under our rules and regulations. We do physical plant inspections of, offices, or if it is a place where children reside, of the actual facility as well. We review agency policies and practices. And then we also, for the ones, again, where there are children residing, we conduct interviews in one-on-one settings with the children to discuss any issues that may be happening at the facility. Each adoption agency is also required to submit to the department's licensing office their fee schedules, and those are available publicly. We publish them on our website. That is the site to go to that, and so it has all of the adoption fees associated with each licensed agency in Tennessee. So anyone can go and look at that and see what the various fees that each agency charges for adoption-related services. They are also required to submit for our annual report information on the number of adoptions completed and the number of home studies completed. Last year, it was reported by our agencies that they completed 578 domestic adoptions, 50 international adoptions, and completed 1,075 home studies. We were also just going to briefly talk to you all about the adoption process from foster care. So in circumstances when children are in the custody of the department, we determine that it is appropriate for termination or surrender or some other action happens where parental rights are terminated, and that child is eligible for adoption. First of all, do you want to talk about this one?
Good job, Bridget, for me. Okay, thank you. As you can see on the screen, last federal fiscal year, Tennessee finalized 1,139 adoptions, and that was down by about 80 from the previous federal fiscal year, and we finalized 287 subsidized guardianship cases, which is just an alternative kind of permanency with relatives for children. Currently, we have about 6,700 families receiving adoption assistance, and 12,000 children are part of those 6,700 families. We also have about 950 kids in full guardianship at this point, and roughly half of those kids have a family identified, which simply means they are on the track for adoption, and typically an adoption occurs within 6 months of full guardianship occurring. But by the same token, we have roughly slightly over 400 kids who don't have a family identified, which means a longer journey to permanency. So, as I've already indicated, to be eligible for adoption, the child must be in full guardianship. All parental rights must be addressed for a child to enter full guardianship, either through termination of parental rights, surrender, or a waiver. All case managers and leadership staff in a region are required to periodically to discuss case progress in terms of moving toward permanency through adoption or SPG. If the decision is made to file a TPR, the case manager is responsible for compiling and submitting that TPR to legal, and then the legal review for the TPR referral occurs to determine if it's acceptable or if it needs to be corrected in some way. And then this slide outlines what happens after the petition is filed. All of these pretty much are legal steps that involve service on all parties, priority over all matters except CPS cases. The hearing is within 6 months of the date the petition is filed. After the hearing, and the trial court enters an order with specific findings of facts and conclusions of law within 30 days, and then there's a 30-day appeal period for biological parents. In Tennessee, we are a foster to adopt state, which means foster parents have priority for adoption. Thus, for the most part, roughly 80% of the adoptions finalized here are by foster parents. The other 20% can be families that are not necessarily fostering. They can be families who've had no involvement with our system, and there are a couple of ways for that to happen. Either they can have an independent home study done and submit it for consideration if they've identified a child they're interested in, or they can become a foster parent and after a period of 6 months are eligible to become part of the group that may be interested in adopting a child. We've already talked about the fact that roughly 400 or slightly more kids are waiting for a family to be identified that's interested in adoption, and we've articulated the primary reasons those kids may still be waiting. For the most part, they're older kids, and in many instances, they've been in care for longer than 18 months. They may be members of a sibling group, and families may be interested in one or more of the sibling group, but not all. The department is very much committed to keeping kids in the sibling group together for permanency if that's at all feasible and possible. And then a large number of our kids who don't have a family identified are kids with higher end mental health, physical, or behavioral needs. And then we offer post-adoptive services to all of our families who adopt kids or enter an agreement for subsidized guardianship. We contract with an independent agency that provides those post-adoption services, and they include counseling, crisis intervention, support groups, advocacy, community education, and post-adoption relief. Obviously, once a family finalizes adoptions, that's totally voluntary, but we provide information on those resources at the point of finalization and once each year. The agency that provides those supports has an excellent track record in terms of adoptions not disrupting after the services are provided. And then for families who have an interest in adopting, we've outlined the primary steps for that process. If they express an interest, either through seeing the kid out online through some formats such as Tennessee Kids Belong or Adopt Us Kids, which is a national modality for outlining kids who are available for adoption. Those individuals can meet with the child's team to discuss their desire to adopt. The team develops a timeline for that process to occur. Then the agency has permanency specialists that guide this work each step along the way and expedite those areas that need to be achieved, such as updating home studies, identifying attorneys, or working with those attorneys to complete the adoption, completing the full disclosure process about a child, and helping the family to sign the intent to adopt. And then a very significant piece of that is reviewing adoption supports after the finalization. Okay.
So that's just an overview of some of the adoption-related services that we have, and so we welcome your questions.
Again, thank you very much for being here. We're all focusing on foster care and adoption this year, so thank you so much for the presentation. And I have a couple of questions, but first, can you share the presentation with us and we can share it with the committee? Send that to my office. Pardon? Oh, it's on dashboard. See what I know about the dashboard. Also, the permanent guardianship, how do you make that, like, can you turn that into an adoption? Or is it just, how do you change it?
So a subsidized permanent guardianship or a permanent guardianship is a separate process because the parents' rights are actually not terminated when you do an SPG or a permanent guardianship. And so the reason behind that is sometimes, particularly with relatives, maybe they don't necessarily want the parents' rights terminated, but they are wanting a permanent arrangement for the child. And so that's when SPG becomes an option. We only really explore SPG, and Sandra may want to speak to this as well, when we have ruled out adoption as being an appropriate option for the child.
So at the front door, obviously, we are always committed to doing a diligent search for appropriate relatives. If it's not feasible for that child, and we may be working, unless there's a significant reason for a child being removed, we're always working a parallel track for reunification and alternative permanency. So when appropriate relatives are identified and they accept a child into their home for a placement, and I should say those relatives have to go through the foster care certification process. But the front door does provide for an expedited process for the relatives. When it becomes clear that reunification is not possible, the relatives are offered the opportunity to either provide permanency through subsidized guardianship or through adoptions. And as Sammy has indicated, oftentimes relatives are not interested in seeing parental rights terminated. They opt for the permanency through subsidized guardianship. The benefits, the back-end benefits are the same in either instance. There's only a few cents difference in the subsidy rate, and all of the back-end post supports are exactly the same.
So how long would it be, how many years of the permanent guardianship before there could be an adoption if neither of the parents are involved?
How long before a family can
many-
achieve the guardianship piece? Well,
Or the adoption piece, where they could actually adopt?
the adoption piece typically would, all things being equal, some adoptions take years, but you have to have a child in your home and have fostered at least 6 months. And then, of course, the termination has to occur. So Sammy can speak probably to the termination timeframes better than I, but once rights are terminated, if a child is placed with a relative in particular, we can almost always finalize an adoption within 6 months.
Okay, thank you. That answers my questions. Are there any other questions from members? Representative Bricken, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Of the one question, and maybe I have two going, but how are families, at how and who kind of selects families for adoption? I mean, who has the pecking order, and is it y'all or the private agencies, or what?
So remember, most of our adoptions occur out of foster care. So the child, once a termination occurs, if the child is in a foster home, the foster home almost always has priority
Okay.
for finalizing the adoption with that child. Every child has a team, better known as the Child and Family Team. That team is involved in the selection process. So barring any real concerns with that foster family, the likelihood is if they are interested in an adoption, that's where it would occur.
If the foster family wants to pursue adoption, but the case manager doesn't feel like it's ready yet, what avenues does a foster family have to go up the chain of command?
There is an appeal process if there is a disagreement, and do you want to address that?
Right. So if you're talking about if they're concerned about the timeframes or the I guess how quickly we are seeking a termination or something to that effect, if I understand your question correctly, a foster parent, they have in their home a foster parent support person that they can speak to. They have supervisors. They can speak to the case manager's supervisor. We have a complete chain of command all the way up to the commissioner. And so we do encourage foster parents to follow that if they're concerned about a case direction. What Deputy Commissioner Wilson was referring to as well is if we have a circumstance where a child has been in a foster parent's home for a period of time, for longer than 12 months, again, they have priority for that child. If we're looking at moving that child out of that foster parent's home and the foster parent disagrees with the move, they have the opportunity for an internal appeal, an administrative procedures appeal within the department to appeal that decision.
Does someone within the department, if y'all looked at cases that the foster children were in homes for longer than 18 months, 2 years, or whatever, do y'all identify reasons why adoption might not be being pursued by those parents or vice versa?
Yeah, so on one end, we are obligated for children who've been in the custody of the department for 15 of the last 22 months to either pursue termination or document a compelling reason why termination is not in that child's best interests.
Yeah, who does that?
The department does. So that is part of our case review processes that we have that Deputy Commissioner mentioned. And so we look at the individual circumstances of the case and why we can't file TPR, or why it's not appropriate to file TPR, or is this a case we should be filing TPR on and we haven't, and then move that process along.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Representative Garrett, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you all for being here and enlightening us on the adoption process. And just, I guess, real two questions. And I know this was a general question, probably hard to get the time frame down, but if you are in the foster program, from what I'm hearing, is that most of the time the adoptions come from a foster family. And so there's a decision to be made, I assume by lawyers, that arises from certain facts of this particular family of when those rights need to be terminated for the parents. And it's usually while in foster care, I would imagine, right? And so I guess my question is, once that determination is made, which I assume is by lawyers, right? I mean, or is there someone that's not a lawyer that's terminating someone's rights and then you proceed that?
No, sir. It would be the attorney that would make the
Okay.
ultimate decision of whether or not we have what we believe to be a legally sustainable ground and best interest proof to prove those.
Great. Okay, good. And then so from that point, how long does it take for a foster family typically to then become the parents of these children, where we know they have a permanent family, so to speak? Because you hear things, right, that takes forever, it's this or that. And I'm just kind of wondering, from generally speaking, and I know that may be a difficult question to ask, but how long does it take once the determination is made that the parents are no longer need to be the parents, and there's those rights out there that need to be terminated? How long does that process take?
So from one, obviously every case is its own set of facts. But so, as we indicated, once that decision is made, the caseworker is responsible for getting that packet together, the information that we would need to draft a termination petition. Once we accept that petition, we have 30 days to draft and file that petition. It gets filed with the court. It does usually take a period of time to serve the parties, so every parent has to be served either personally or by publication. So assuming we know where the parents are, we can serve them right away. That's still going to take a couple weeks. Then we are looking at getting a court date set. This does vary widely by area because some courts have more strains on their docket time than others, but it is going to take a couple months at least to get a hearing date on that termination, and that's assuming that your termination goes to trial on your first set. So from that up to even the termination trial, probably about 6 months, assuming everything has gone to plan. After that happens, the judge has up to 30 days to render their order. Then after that 30 days, there's a 30-day waiting period for the Court of Appeals for any party to appeal. So we've tacked on at least another 60 days, likely. And if there is an appeal, then we are looking at another year on top of that, because that is a
An appeal
process.
by the parent.
By the parent or the guardian ad litem.
Right.
And the parties can appeal, or the department can appeal a termination as well. For example, if we lose, we can appeal. We don't do that very often. But so any of the parties can appeal. But so if that happens, that is another year or so tacked on to the permanency for that child. On the back end, if once that child is free for adoption, they are in full guardianship, then is
So once they are free for adoption, if the child is in a home, already placed in a home with what we call a family identified that's open to and willing to adopt, if the child has been there for at least 6 months, it can happen pretty quickly, sometimes within a week of the final order. But certainly, it never takes, I shouldn't say never, but it would be unusual for it to take longer than a few months if the family is identified and already has expressed an interest in adoption. The delays come in when we have a termination of parental rights and no family is identified for that child. It's hard to say how long that might take. We do archaeological digs, we do diligent search again, so we actually contract for archaeological digs to try to trace back to find relatives or fictive kin that are interested in adoption.
Would legislation help for a time frame to be established that the department's done all efforts to identify a family, and once those efforts are exhausted, then it could speed up the process? Has there been any discussion regarding
Well,
those instances where you can't find the families and you've done everything possible to do that?
well, actually, we are exploring, and I'm not at liberty to give the full details yet. We are exploring partnering with an agency that has expertise in deeper archaeological digs to help us with those kids who remain in the system long term, and we've been unable to find interested either family members or individuals at all who might be willing to provide lifetime permanency for kids.
Good deal. Well, I could just thank you for that explanation. And the only reason why I asked that is that, time is of the essence in these matters, of course. And so to have and the court system is what it is. I'm a practicing lawyer, so I understand those deadlines that you go through during appeals and whatnot. But anything that we can do to help with timing for this little kids that are in these situations is something that we want to be very helpful on. So I appreciate y'all being here and enlightening us on this process. Thank you very much for that.
Representative Gant, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. With the status of older children, what's the process that y'all go through on identifying parents for them?
So actually, the first step is to exhaust all avenues at our disposal to try to find relatives for older kids, or for sibling groups, because it's equally difficult to find placement resources for large sibling groups. If we are unable to find family members, then of course the second step is to look at foster parents who may be willing to parent that group of kids. Every foster parent has a profile in our system that indicates the age range and the characteristics of the kids that they're willing to foster. So that's our second step. You may or may not be aware of the fact that we recently received approval to offer specific incentives for foster parents who are willing to foster teens or for large sibling groups. We're currently in the process of developing the policy to govern that process. Once the policy is finalized, we will have a mechanism to pay those foster parents an enhanced rate as long as they agree to foster a kiddo, a teen, for 6 months or longer. And the thought process behind that is, once you have a child in the home and the department has wrapped appropriate supports around the foster parent and the teen, a bond will develop that makes you more likely to want to make that long term. So, does that answer your question?
Yes, ma'am. I have one more question,
Go ahead.
Madam Chair. Would you say teens are the hardest age bracket to find adoption for?
I feel like they absolutely are. Now, it could be a sibling group that has a teen or teens in the blend, but there seems to be a pervasive kind of reluctance about teen behavior. And sometimes it's things that are perfectly normal for teenagers, but the tolerance level for it seems to become more and more prevalent.
Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Representative Powell, you're recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Could you speak to those situations where you have multiple siblings and the challenges that arise there? And, I would assume, but is there an intent to try to keep those siblings together when they're going through this process?
There's absolutely, we train on a practice model that commits to keeping siblings together unless it's absolutely untenable. Occasionally there may be a child in the group that's a risk to the other siblings or to himself, and the child's team may make a decision for separation. But that's not taken lightly, and keeping sibs together is a decision that's made by the child's team and that considers all factors for each member of that sibling group.
Any other questions? Representative Bricken.
It's just a follow-up of Representative Garrett's question. Just how many abandoned babies do y'all get? And if they're totally abandoned, how do you even start working on the ancestral or the family connections there?
So there's two different definitions, I think, of abandonment. So we have a category of child called a safe haven baby, and that's the voluntary abandonment of an infant. And there are statutes that govern that, and so we don't do that archaeological dig, those types of things with a true safe haven baby. In fact, the idea is that baby gets to be safely left, that parent can walk away without any questions, without any information. We don't seek that information as long as the baby is left in an unharmed condition. So those babies typically go into a regular foster home. On the flip side, if you have a circumstance where it's not a safe haven baby, but the parents have abandoned the infant, or they've left an infant, we can't get in contact with them, we just dig through our systems as best as we can about information. And then again, those circumstances where a parent may not have contact for a period of time, those are usually the ones too that we can potentially move towards termination faster, because there's a specific ground for abandonment where you fail to visit or support your child for a period of 4 months. Very few. It's less than 10 a year. I think in the last 4 or 5 years, it's been around 30, 35.
Thank y'all very much for coming today. That was very informative, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more questions later but we can send emails and stuff. But thank y'all for being here.
Thank you for
Thank
having
you
us.
all. Thank
So
you very
next
much.
we're going to hear from one of my favorite adoptive parents, Chairman Faison. If you could come forward and and introduce yourself for the record, please. Overruled.
Good afternoon. My name is Jeremy Faison, and it is such an honor to be with you, committee. Chair Lady, I love what you're doing. I think it is so important for the public to know all the ins and outs of fostering and adopting and what the struggles are facing our children today. In my opinion, they're some of the most precious assets that God gave us in our state. Chair Lady Littleton asked me to come share with you all my story of fostering my son and fostering him to adopt him. So I'll just briefly tell you, because I know y'all are busy. 17 years ago, my wife came home. She'd worked the nursery at our church that day. And at lunch, she said, honey, there was a little boy that's about 13 months old in nursery today. And he's so sweet. And DCS has taken him into custody. And I was like, oh, that's nice. Wonderful. And she's like, well, I think you should meet him. Okay, be glad to meet him. Why do you want me to meet this child? Does he have foster parents? Yes, he does. So I just kind of scratched my head. And she's like, well, I just really fell in love with him, and I want you to meet him. I was like, well, honey, okay. Who are the people? I didn't know them. They just started coming to our church. She's like, I don't really know them. I was like, well, how do you propose we go about this? She's like, well, I got their number. I'm going to call them and see if we can come over this afternoon. I'm like, oh, okay. This is a little awkward, but all right. So she calls them, and they're like, yeah, come over. We get over there, don't know the people, introduce ourselves. They'd seen me. I lead worship at my church, so they'd seen me. And we sit down and hold this little guy, and they were foster parents through DCS, and kind of took up a friendship with him. I have a biological son who was 1 at the time. They're 3 weeks apart in age. They were both 1. And we're like, well, that's, they kind of oohed and awed with each other for a minute, whatever you can do at 13 months old. And so we left, and I'm like, well, that was trying to strange in my mind. And she's like, there's something special about this guy. And I was like, all right, cool. And we started talking to them a little bit more, and Miriam would say, well, maybe we would invite him over for a play date with Reagan. And so we would bring little Gage over just to give the foster parent some time. If you've ever fostered a child, the ability to be able to have just some downtime where you don't have to be on. If you're a mama, you know what I mean when I say you don't have to be on, is a good thing. So we would do that. Then we got permission from DCS for him to actually spend the night a few times. Come to find out, this fostering couple were having marital problems, and we didn't know about that. And DCS approached us and said, listen, there's some issues going on with this family. They might be moving out of the area. They might be going through a divorce. Would y'all consider fostering a child? And I knew nothing about fostering other than just my son has got a little buddy that comes over. This was over like a 6-month period. And so we said, sure. And they said, we have to take classes. I'm like, oh, wow. So we went through these classes called PATH classes. Even if you're not going to be an adoptive parent, and for anybody listening, I would encourage you to go sit through some of these classes. It's amazing the things you can learn. It was a 10-week course that we went through, and after we got done with that, sure enough, that family was moving out, and they moved little Gage in with us. Well, by this time, Miriam and I are very interested in what's going on with his biological parents. As DCS, their mentality is their number one goal is reunification. That used to be my goal, is reunification, and that is no longer my goal, and I would counteract them and say our number one goal should be what's best for that child. And Gage, my wife and I realized what's best for that child is not reunification. However, they went down that path for the next 3 years, 2.5, 3 years, trying to make that happen. The biological dad had no desire to be with him or see him. He has several children all over America that he's sired. The biological mama was in prison for multiple serious crimes and wasn't going to get out until he was significantly older. So we were in court several times, 6 different times. The court was trying to press her. Finally, after the 6th or 7th time, she surrendered her rights to the state because she couldn't pass. They call them perm plans, permanent plans for permanency. She couldn't pass any of that, especially being in prison. Even if she was going to get out, she was going to struggle with that. She had a problem with substance abuse. And so after that, Gage becomes not just a ward, I mean, he becomes literally more than a ward of the state because both parents have surrendered their right. And then Miriam and I moved into the next phase, and we adopted him by the time he was 4. And we like to think, looking at what could have taken place and where the biological parents have struggled, it hurts our heart. We like to think that we've offered him an alternative to what could have been. There's some children who face some more horrible things than any of us might face in our entire lifetime. They face it by the time they're 5 years old because of substance abuse. And Gage, my adopted son, has just had a child. So we have a grandbaby now because of him. And I will tell you this, it's not all beautiful and rosy and wonderful. Adoption's difficult. And there are some tough times. But it's a noble thing. Fostering and adopting is very noble. And in the long run, you know that you've done something right for a child who might not have ever had a chance.
Thank you for sharing that.
Love you.
Love
Thank
you
you.
too. Are there any questions right quick for Chairman Faison? Representative Carey.
Thank you. I've never heard that, so I appreciate you sharing your testimony here. And I'm curious, there's lots of bills that are coming through that deal with adoption, and you said that most time when folks get into some marital issues, the parenting plans, all of that is in the best interest of the children first. There's lots of bills that are coming through, I think, that are trying to make the judge start at 50-50, and that's not the best interest of the kids a lot of times. And so my question to you is, you had said that that's their goal, and that goes to a little bit of the question I asked before. You were involved, I believe, in the court system, and it's still, you met this Gage, when he was very young, and he was 4 before you actually were able to adopt him. So I'm curious, and this is not a gotcha question, I hope, by any means, but what could have sped up that process? I mean, luckily, in a sense, I don't know, maybe that's not the right word, but he was so young, he probably doesn't remember that process. But if he was 5 or 6 when you were first introduced to him and there was a spark between your other child and him, he would have remembered that process of 3 or 4 years that it took to finally, hey, the Faisons are my parents now. And so what would have been better during that time that could have sped that up? Where was it the department not looking for reunification and looking at the best interest, or was there something else that could have sped that process up where now you can look back and see the success that has? What are your thoughts on that?
So, great question. it was very obvious on from the time that we were foster parents, when he wasn't even 2 years old, that reunification was not going to happen. It was very obvious. For whatever reason, in that instance, the state still, it would have appeared to us, drug their feet. And that wasn't what was in best interest of him. If he'd have been older, I think it would have been more traumatic for him. At that age, I don't think he knew one way or the other. He barely remembers us adopting him. Maybe for optical reasons, Representative, we don't really understand. But I've watched several times that the courts or the state have drugged their feet, maybe for reasons of somebody be able to come back a year or two later and try to undo what happened and sue to have their child back because they've got it right. That's why some of the laws that we're passing are important. If you have allowed to get yourself in such a situation that over a 6-month plan, you can't get yourself in a place that you can handle a child, how do we know that the next 6 months you're going to do it too? And the perm plans aren't very hard. If she was still here, she could walk you through some of the common sense perm plans. We're talking easy things like being able to pass a drug test over the next few months. We're talking about having a job. We're talking about keeping your house in such a way that a child could live there. We're not talking major things. We're talking something that even doesn't have a degree. You don't have to. You don't even have to be able to graduate out of high school. We're just saying just normal, common sense things that would give your child an expectation of some kind of safety. And if you can't pull that together within a year of your life, 6 months of your life, which is what some of our bills do, at some point we have to say what's best for the child. Now, you also brought up about a judge splitting 50-50. That's a conversation I loved having. I don't think that, but that's a conversation y'all need to dive into because there's some real issues at our court level that happen with that.
Thank you, Chairman Ferguson. Appreciate it.
Any other questions? Thank you again. And next we will hear from Jeremy Harrell and the adoption project. And Lauren Webb is also an adoptive parent. She will be presenting with Jeremy Harrell. If y'all would please come forward and introduce yourself. Thank y'all very much for being here. I think we have another success story to hear about with Lauren, and we're hoping for a lot of success stories with the adoption project. So again, if you would just introduce yourself for the record.
Good morning, Jeremy Harrell. I founded the Adoption Project and president of the organization. Can I say thank you, Chairman Littleton, for inviting us to be here today and for the work that you have done with Senator Hale over in the Senate side. We're really excited about some of the things coming through there. To committee members, appreciate you hearing us today. To Governor Lee and Commissioner Quinn and the rest of the administration for it's a big announcement last night and a real significant investment there. We're excited about and learning more about the details there. Also to the department for the tremendous amount of work that they do to help the most vulnerable kids in our state. We really appreciate the effort that they put in. And then just one little personal thing, Representative Stevens is my personal state rep, so excited that you're a part of this committee. If I could just share, we know all of these kids up here. 2 of them are mine. The middle, in the top middle is Rosie, and lower right is Ruby. They're half-sisters that my
and
wife
they're
and I
beautiful.
adopted. Thank you. And then the other children on here, we know all of them, all adopted through various means and methods, so and have permission from their families to include them up there. This was based totally on kind of our personal experience as people who live in Tennessee and adopted 2 children who were born in Tennessee. They were born down in Cleveland and surrendered there. Ultimately, the process for our first adoption, which was Ruby, that took about 3 years from the time we started our home study to the time that we finalized it in the court, and we faced some challenges and some heartbreak along the way, which is, I think, a fairly common story that you hear as you talk to people who have adopted. I get a little bit emotional about it. I'm going to try to be careful. The day that we picked Ruby up, the day that she came to be with us, I have two very clear memories from that day. One is the overwhelming joy that we felt as a family, but the other was recognizing the tremendous amount of grief that her mom must have felt in that moment, because she was there and she literally, like physically, placed her child with us and trusted her to us. So that kind of guides everything that we think about as we go through and think about changes that may be necessary or needed to the adoption process. Private adoption is governed almost totally by state law, particularly if you're adopting in-state. I would argue that no state on the whole does it best, right? There are pieces that are better some places than others, but on the whole, I would say nobody really does it best. As part of that development, we learned that most adoptions happen through foster care, and so that is why we kind of included that in our mission, and the things we talked about is how do we talk about foster care and help in that system as well. Let's see. Oh, it does work that way. So because it's governed almost entirely by state law, I thought, given my background, I know how to do something about that. So we set this up with the mission. We launched in March of 2022 publicly to develop and advocate for policies to make it easier to build strong families through adoption, and that are in the best interests of the adoptive parents and the child and the placing parents, the folks who want to make a voluntary placement for their child, with a vision that every child should have a safe, loving, and permanent family. Now, we primarily, as we've talked to a number of people, Lauren is on our policy committee, so she's one of the early folks that we talk to, but we primarily get three questions as we talk to people. One, why does it cost so much? Two, why does it take so long? Three, why do so many people that I know adopt from other states or other countries? And I know that Lauren is going to talk about her experience adopting from another state and kind of why that was the path that they chose. I'll share this. We set a set of our priorities for 2023. For the sake of time, I'm going to just talk briefly about a few things and keep it on private adoption and not foster care for us. So this shows a visual of the surrender process and timing in Tennessee as it compares to two other states, Florida and Utah. Now, I am going to preface all of this by saying I'm not advocating and would not advocate that we try to mirror Florida or Utah. I think there are some issues in their systems. This is just more to show the kind of half time that you can get in some scenarios. The reason that timeline is important, in my view, is that, one, that's the greatest period of uncertainty for an adoptive family, right? So a child is born, the child is placed, you go through a surrender period, then you go through a revocation period, and in some circumstances, that child is in the home of the prospective adoptive family and could be removed by the time you get to the end of that period based on the decisions that get made. So that's why that timeline is so important for the adoptive family. It's also important for the child in that it's a delay in that permanence in this period of time where the bonding is so important, right? Representative Garrett mentioned kind of if you're an older child going through a foster care process and how you would remember that. Well, that bonding time for that infant is super important in that first week or weeks of life and how they interact with the family that will be their family from that point forward. I would also point out these timelines are not mandated. They are the shortest timeline, right? They can always be longer, but these are the shortest times that those voluntary placements can be made. And there are also differences in the manner of surrender, right? How a child is surrendered, court versus out of court, who's a party to that surrender, and things like that. It gets really complex and complicated as you move across various states. And frankly, I think there are some things that we do in Tennessee that are better than other states that could be replicated there, primarily around guardianship and the way that works for a placement. I purposely did not make a specific recommendation here because I think there are some factors to talk about, but I do think that we can get this shorter. It doesn't have to be a full 7-day period. There are ways to bring that down in a way that gets that child into a permanent situation faster. And I would also just say that the way our law is currently written, for our girls, for example, we live in Tennessee. They were born in Tennessee. We follow the Tennessee statute for the placement, for the surrender. If I lived in Florida, adopting those same children, we could follow the Florida surrender period. If I lived in Utah, we could follow the Utah surrender period. Again, not advocating for those states, but just pointing out that in some cases, a resident in Tennessee is actually at a disadvantage when it comes to adopting a child born here. One other thing, just to keep this short, I'm not going to talk a lot. This is the finalization period, so currently in 6 months, and most states, to be fair, it is 6 months, but from placement to finalization, you have a child in your home 6 months to be finalized. Florida can get that done in 3 months. I think Chairman Littleton, this is part of one of your bills that would bring this period down. This is important, again, for that permanence for the child, but also to point out you get your birth certificate once your adoption's finalized, right? So, and you don't get your new Social Security number with your new name until after you have your birth certificate. So that affects a lot of things just in terms of the paperwork, and think about all the things you can't do without a Social Security number or birth certificate, right? So that is really what that is about. I always try to keep this focused for us on the main thing, right? Because I've talked about why it's important for the child or important for the adoptive parent. I do think in all of these conversations, it's important to keep at the front of our mind that the purpose of this system is to find a family for a child who needs a family. It's not to find a baby for me, right? Or find a baby for Lauren. It's to find a family for this kid who really genuinely needs a family. And how do we do that in the most efficient and effective way that fosters permanence for that kid, that treats everybody with respect, that understands all the different things at play here, and honors all of those connections and commitments. And if we lose sight of that, then we risk kind of treating this as a commodity system, right? And I don't think any of us are interested in that, treating as a child as a product. So how do we keep that forefront in our mind? I think we would all agree, just to go back to this is Rosie, by the way. She's a sweetie. Every child should have a safe, loving, and permanent family. It seems like a pretty unifying statement. We might have some differences in how we get there and how we accomplish the goal, but I think it's pretty there. And we do believe that we can work together and we can make this the best place to build strong families through adoption and foster care. And when I say that, I don't necessarily mean adoptive families through foster care. We can build strong families through foster care by reunification, by guardianship, by adoption, when we view it holistically that way.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Jeremy? Lauren, could you
All right.
introduce yourself? and
Yes.
record?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Appreciate you allowing me to be here today, and appreciate the committee as well for allowing me to be here today. My name is Lauren Webb. I know that you all know me as the Legislative Director for the Comptroller's Office. Today, I am not here in that role. I am here actually in my most favorite role, which is being a mother, and most importantly, being a mother to my oldest son, Henry, who we did adopt through private adoption services. So just wanted to stress that anything that I do say here today is reflective of my personal views, not the Comptroller's Office and not the Comptroller himself. However, with that being said, as you all know, the Comptroller is an adoptive parent himself. And this is very much an issue that is near and dear to both of our hearts and that we both care about deeply. And also just want to say my husband, John Webb, is also in the audience today as well. And whenever we started this adoption process, one of the first people that we did talk to was the Comptroller, Jason Mumpower, and we talked to him and asked for his advice and his guidance and wanted to hear about his story. And so he shared his story with us. And one of the recommendations that he gave us was to check out and maybe if it's a right fit to go through the adoption agency that he adopted through, and that's an agency out of Georgia. So whenever my husband and I were doing our research to see which agency fit our needs or what we were looking for, we did in fact ultimately decide to go with the adoption agency that he adopted through out of Georgia. So there were a lot of considerations that we took into account, but I'm only going to talk about 3 of them right now. The first consideration being cost. You know, I know Jeremy talked about it is expensive. The adoption process is very pricey, so that was one of our considerations. The second consideration was time, the time commitment. And by time, I really mean 3 different things. The time from whenever you become an active parent to child placement, so that time frame. The revocation period, which in Georgia, the revocation period is 4 days for the birth parents or the birth mother. And then also the time spent going to court. In Georgia, we did not have to go to court at all in Georgia. And Henry's birth mother also did not have to go to court. All of the paperwork was done there in the hospital. And so I want to talk about this just a little bit more for a second before I get to my third consideration. I think that Chairman Faison mentioned this, and I believe Jeremy might have mentioned this as well, is whenever you arrive at the hospital or you arrive wherever you are going to pick up, your child, that process is very emotional. There are a lot of emotions. There are a lot of emotions for the adoptive parents. There are a lot of emotions for the birth parents during that process. And so anything that that can be done to make that process a little bit more seamlessly, more convenient, and easier on both the birth parents and the adoptive parents is very helpful. And so signing the paperwork there in the hospital in front of a notary really made this process a lot more convenient and easier on all parties. So getting back to our considerations, our third consideration in going with this agency was the support that the agency provided for the birth parents throughout the pregnancy, and then especially even after the birth mother gives birth. The agency that we went through provided all kinds of support, and it is voluntary upon the birth parents. They can seek out the support from the agency, but it's not just medical support, in recovery, in the recovery process, but it's also mental health support. They offer job training for the birth parents, and any other kind of help or anything that could be helpful to the birth parents for as long as the birth parents needed that support and that assistance. So those were our 3 main considerations, and like I said, ultimately we ended up going with that adoption agency in Georgia. So we became active parents and in that agency's program in about November or December of 2020. Our agency advised us that the general process with this particular agency is whenever you become an active parent, usually birth mothers come into their program sometime around the beginning of their 3rd trimester. So that's what we were expecting, that our life book would be shown to potential birth moms who want to be in this program. We would get picked by a birth mom, and then we would have, a couple of months to prepare for this new child coming home with us. That was not our case. We received a phone call on March the 4th of 2021, and our caseworker from the adoption agency that called us said, "Hey, I've got great news. You all have been chosen by a birth mom to be parents to a baby boy." And so my husband and I were so ecstatic. Just thrilled, couldn't believe it. And so the conversation kept going, and we said, "Great. When is the birth mother due? When is our baby due?" And the caseworker said, "Well, your baby was born 2 days ago on March the 2nd of 2021. And so then our excitement kind of went to, oh my goodness, we have nothing at our house that's ready for a baby. What do we do now? And so we asked the caseworker, what do we need to do? How soon do we need to get to Georgia? What are the next steps? So she directed us to get to Georgia as soon as possible to come meet your child. And so we ended up wrapping up work on Friday, literally went to Target and just pulled everything off the shelf that we thought a baby might need, because I said this is our oldest son, so we've never been parents before, so we had no idea what a baby needs other than diapers and wipes and a car seat. So went and bought everything on Saturday, packed up the car Sunday, and off we went to Georgia. And so whenever we got there, our son was born with a little infection, and so he had to be in the NICU for 10 days to get a full round of antibiotics. But the birth mom at that time had already surrendered. The revocation period had already expired because it was only 4 days. So by the time we got there, the revocation period had already expired. So then as soon as we got there, we went to the hospital and we signed the paperwork. And everything was done there in the hospital in front of a notary. And we were able to meet the birth mother there. Obviously, we were able to meet our son there. And it was a very emotional experience that is very hard to describe, the amount of emotions that you go through. So what happened after that was basically we did have to wait on our son to get out of the NICU. And once he got out of the NICU, then the ICPC process could start at that point in time. The ICPC process in Georgia was pretty slow, but once the paperwork finally arrived in Tennessee, DCS did a great job at turning around our paperwork in literally a matter of hours. It was very quick, and we were so appreciative of that. So once ICPC got finalized and approved, then we were able to come back to Tennessee. So we were in Georgia for roughly 2 weeks.
What's ICPC?
The International Child Placement. Interstate, I'm sorry,
Oh,
Interstate,
okay.
Compact. Basically approving that you're not just taking a child across state lines without proper authority. Yes, yes. So once we got back to Tennessee, we did have to wait for the adoption agency in Georgia to terminate the father's rights. And so we had to wait on the process to attempt to locate him. And then if he couldn't be located, then go through the court to terminate. And that's ultimately what they did. So they terminated the father's rights in about July timeframe. And then the agency then handled the whole court process and getting the adoption finalized in Georgia, and without us having to ever go back, which was very convenient. Then Georgia sent the paperwork here to Tennessee, and that paperwork arrived in about September, October timeframe. And then we were able to get on the docket in December of 2021 to get our adoption completely finalized in the court. And so now it was a pretty lengthy process. I do think it was a little bit shorter than Jeremy's, which was about 3 years. So ours was a little bit shorter. But I will say now, Henry, we are about to celebrate his 2nd birthday, and he is a very vibrant and energetic little boy that has the most joyous personality of anybody I've ever met. He is, if you see him, you will automatically smile. You just can't help but smile at this little boy. And so I am so glad that we went through this process, and that and so thankful for his birth mother and the courageous decision that she made, and the very difficult decision that she made. She is very, very brave, and I am so blessed that she picked us. So thank you for allowing me to share my story.
Thank you very much. And your presentation is on the dashboard, so if anyone's listening, they can pull up the information off the dashboard. And you mentioned the bond, and we know how important that it is when newborns. I think the bonding is the most important thing. So it's an emotional thing for all of us, and just listening to it, it's emotional. But we also have to think about those children that do not get that bonding and need that special bonding as it maybe 2 or 3 years down the road. But every child deserves a loving family. So our little motto in this committee is we want to save every child, but if we can't, we'll save them one at a time. So we look forward to working with you in your project. Representative Powell, did you have something to say?
Thank you, Chair Lady. So interesting enough, actually, my wife has a employee who is going through this process right now. A baby was actually born yesterday, so I've kind of learned about this through through that, through asking her questions and them going through that process. I wanted to ask a couple questions, and one is, and I totally agree. You know, we clearly don't want to treat our children as commodities, and but price was mentioned a couple times, and you know, as a parent with two children, you know, and I know other parents here, clearly there's a cost to raising children, but when you talk about price, can you talk about, is that the expense of like having children, or is it cost that you have to pay for legal fees, for going through this process to the agency? Like, what exactly is that cost? And is there a way that we could maybe, you know, as a state, help lessen the burden of the cost outside of just basic child care?
Let me intervene a second. I'd like for both of you guys to answer that and kind of compare what you paid in Georgia and what it would have cost in Tennessee.
Yeah.
Sorry to-
So the cost in our experience was at certain steps, you pay just a little bit each time. So I think it was, and we went through the agency, which we had to pay, but then our home study cost was separate because we had to get our home study through an agency here in Tennessee. So our home study cost was separate. And so, and you had to pay, I think, a little bit before the home study started. Then I think after the second or the first home study, you had to finalize the payment for the home study piece itself. But then there's this additional cost for the actual agency that we went through, and I believe it was initial $5,000 to actually be in their program. So once you complete their application and submit it, I think it was $5,000. But then, and there might have been one other payment between the initial $5,000 and then whenever you finalize at or whenever you go to the hospital to meet your child. But the bulk of it is a one-time payment that you have to pay whenever you go to meet your child, finalize that paperwork, and pick up your child. And that was a significant cost. I believe we paid $35,000 or $40,000, something like that, at one time. And so that's why you will often see folks going through the adoption process doing fundraising, simply because it is a one-time bulk payment. And it's kind of, you know, if it was spread out payments over time, that's one thing. But a one-time bulk payment is a little bit different. And every agency is different and has different fees. I think some in Tennessee range anywhere from $35,000 to $40,000, maybe even $50,000. I think there are some upwards of $60,000 or $70,000.
So if I could just add on, first, the department publishes by agency on their website the fee schedule for each agency, and it's by agent, right? I think it's a PDF, but they can say that, but of like this agency, here's their fee schedule, this agent, and so on and so forth, which was helpful to look at. It does range, I don't mind to tell you just exactly what ours, because we have an open relationship with our girl's birth mom, right, which I love. I encourage everybody who can do it to do it. It's been really good for us, good for her, good for the girls. It's going to be good for them as they move through life as well. But so we went two different pathways. With our oldest, she came to us when she was 3 weeks old. That was through an agency. The total cost of that was in the range of $30,000 to $35,000. And then for our youngest, because we didn't go through an agency, we didn't pay that placement fee portion, some other ancillary things, it's about half the cost of that. We used a private attorney. We paid a private attorney for her who was her attorney as well, which our state law requires and should, because she should have that representation as well. But that's the difference in that schedule. Now, you do get into some situations where you start hearing about adoptions that cost $50,000, $75,000, $100,000. When you get into that range, usually you're talking about people who are adopting out of another state. Usually it's from a state that maybe allows some things that we don't allow here for good cause. And they're sometimes utilizing a consultant or what we call a facilitator or a broker in that system. And so you start, which we ban brokers here. Though I think there actually is a bill that attempts to address that. I think we're going to keep working together to make sure the language gets right on it. But further strengthen our prohibitions on those kinds of things here, but that's where you start to get into those really expensive adoptions where, frankly, you do start, right? People pay to get to the front of the line and that sort of thing.
That's all right. And I guess just a follow-up question. That's very helpful. I didn't know that. From a policy perspective, and I get there are costs that need to be paid because services are being provided. But from a policy perspective, I mean, what is? Can you rationalize the justification of those expenses, or I mean, do you think those is something we can look at, or other states have addressed that? Have you looked at that? Is cost being a contributing factor to the lack of adoptions in our state?
So on our in our agency adoption, for example, just to be practical about it, right? The placement fee that you're paying, that's how they operate, right? That's how they provide the service that they're providing. Makes sense. The number of adoptions across the country is going down. It's going down here. It's just right, more people are able to parent and that sort of thing. So they need those fees to keep the doors open. The remainder of those things are we're paying for our home study, right? We're paying for our home study update. We're paying for the placement visits. We're paying legal fees to our own attorney, my attorney's actually here. Great attorney. I recommend her to everybody who's doing an adoption. But and very reasonable in her fees too. I was very happy with that. But I wanted to make sure I said that.
No advertising here.
I'm not advertising, but the home study, right? So the home study is very important, right? Because you have to make sure that you're placing a child into a safe family, and that you're giving on the private side, right? That you're giving the parent who's making that placement the assurance that this family I'm trusting my child to is safe, right? And so there's some expenses. Now, we, and I'm very glad that we do not have an income tax. We don't have a way to rebate through an income tax structure like you do at the federal level, which you do get. There are some things that maybe we could do in terms of the cost of home studies, right? Could we do something there? I would be a little hesitant to just purely subsidize something, because I think if you move too close to subsidizing a private adoption, you could risk some harm to the foster care system, right? But are there some things that we could do along the payment of the cost of home studies and those sorts of things within a schedule, right? Some people might charge exorbitant fees. You don't want to get in the business of that. But within a schedule, are there some things that we could do as a state? Potentially, things like that would bring the cost down a little bit. Sure.
And one final question, and again, I don't want to mean any disrespect because I know you adopted from a adjacent state, but when you look at what we looked at the stats and the shorter process, again from a policy perspective, with a goal as Tennessee policymakers, I think everyone on this committee would want to see greater adoption participation and rates and fewer children both in foster care and in adoption. Do you feel like we're losing out to potential adoptive parents from other states? And is that something you think that would help Tennessee, encourage us to, stay and adopt in Tennessee, that period?
Yeah, it's a very, very fair question. And in fairness and full disclosure, we didn't limit ourselves to Tennessee. Our girls just happened to be born here. And so the process worked out here for us. We've looked other places as well. I don't think we're ever going to get to a place where, kids born in Tennessee don't get adopted in other states and people in Tennessee don't adopt from other states. But I do think there's a way to level the playing field perhaps a little bit to in a way that a family who lives in another state where it works differently doesn't have an advantage against a family who lives in Tennessee, and that in some situations I don't have an advantage as an adoptive parent to adopt a child born in another state just because of the security of that placement once it's made. Now I didn't go into details. I'm going to push back against some of those other states. The main issue that I see in a state like Florida versus Tennessee, right? Florida does not have a revocation period for an infant. So once that surrender is signed, it's irrevocable. That's a really big decision, right? Is 3 days too long? I can make that argument, but is 0 too short? 100% of the time, zero's too short. And so what's the right balance to bring that timeline down in a way that helps level that playing field, but doesn't take away a person's right who's making a voluntary placement, right? That's the big picture there.
Representative Bricken.
Kind of a follow-up. The agencies, are they private, for-profit companies or private nonprofit?
I think that they are both for-profit and nonprofit, depending on the agency, but to operate here, must be licensed by the departments. Yes? Okay.
So
You can be for-profit or nonprofit.
in the home study courses, are they put on by profit agents, companies, or nonprofit?
A home study can be conducted by a licensed clinical social worker who may or may not work for the agency. I think that's right as well.
Okay.
So any licensed clinical social worker, like I can go hire an independent licensed clinical social worker to do my home study. I can work with the social worker at the agency to do my home study, and the agency may or may not be nonprofit. But they do have to be licensed.
And roughly the cost of the home study process?
Ours was about $1,500 for that initial home study. I think, again, it's on the schedule that DCS publishes. I think it ranges from like $800 to $2,000 depending on where you are. And for the agencies, right, it's just how they're differentiating their fees, right? How are they structuring their fee schedule?
And I do just want to add that I know for our agency, and I think for most adoption agencies, private adoption agencies, they do. Our agency would send us a quarterly report that says, 20% of the money that we're taking in is going towards admin, 50% is going towards services or something like that. So, and I think that's pretty standard across agencies.
Yeah.
I have one last question.
Yeah.
The foster care home study, is it the same as the adoptive home study?
I think that the answer depends on. I think this may be a DCS question. The home study for a DCS foster care placement or DCS foster to adopt is one thing. My understanding is you cannot use a DCS home study for a private adoption. That is a different process. That's my understanding of it.
Do you know why? Do you know why?
I do not know the answer to that.
Okay, we'll look that up.
Yeah.
Representative Jernigan.
I'm going to end it with, are you going to expose your son to the Georgia Bulldogs? Are you going to let him find out on his own? How's that going to work
Out of
out?
order.
We are true Tennessee Volunteer fans, and we absolutely love every time that we beat Georgia.
Any other questions? Thank y'all so much. It got a little more involved than even we thought it would, so thank y'all very much for being here, and for DCS and Chairman Faison. So we really appreciate it, and I'm sure there'll be many more questions to come. So thank y'all for being here. So we're going to go back into session. Is there any other business? Seeing none, without objection, we stand adjourned.